Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Where did that whole like Marxist thing come from with you?
For me, it was undergrad. I was one of the two teachers I mentioned. He was economist. Harry Cleaver was his name, and he was a Marxist economist, and he taught a class on Marxist economics, which is basically reading Capital Volume 1 with a novel like Mary Barton or Upton Sinclair's Jungle, which is a novel about, you might have heard of that novel, right?
My dad actually read that.
Really?
I will never forget it. He basically failed out of high school. He didn't really.
Yeah.
That he really didn't do well. And that I think I'm the first one in my family line to ever go to college, basically. And so that he said that the jungle was something that he will always remember from school.
And it really changed like Teddy Roosevelt's mind, to start pushing laws for sanitation conditions in the factories and so on. But anyway, Harry was just an amazing guy. He deconstructed. I mean, he hated most Marxisms. He was one of the most vehement and sharpest critics of dominant forms of Marxism, including Maoism or Stalinism or Trotskyism. So his Marxism was based on reading Marx, not the party, the ideologies, the different regimes. It's like you might have heard of this term like revivalist in terms of Christianity. Some people want to go back to the roots. They don't want to go through the institution of a church, but they want to go back to the text of the gospel, to go back to the original and really think for themselves. And that's been kind of a forceful revival for many different churches. So Harry came out of the movement in the 60s. Anti-war, civil rights. I think he went to jail for struggling for civil rights. Voter registration among African Americans and so on. So Marx was for him a way to understand the world. And at least for me, when I was growing up, I spent part of my life in Japan. Everywhere around the world except the U.S., Marx is part of the classics. He's right next to Plato. It doesn't even get. It's funny. When I came to the U.S., I still was living on the last legs of the Cold War, and there was a kind of reflexive anti-communism, which is a form of anti-intellectualism, right? Because I'm not just talking about Marx, but the Marxist traditions, I should say, plural S, is very complicated. Just like Buddhist doctrines of different, Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, or the Church, Roman Catholic, with all the different groups today. For example, one of my friends is very he's a Catholic, and his church is very much against homophobia, against the war, and that kind of so there's a kind of energy. There are different energies within a church and within ideologies and within ideas. So but the only reason I really got into Marx was because, like you, we have these encounters, right? You read a book by, Hugh Laurie, and you go, Stephen, this guy might be interesting, right? Stephen Fry. The same thing here. I'm kind of curious. Like you pick up a CD or a song from an iPod shuffle, and you go, this is an interesting song. That's what had happened for me. Harry just substituted for a class that I was taking, and he just kind of blew me away. Yeah. So, if he was talking about Max Weber, it would have been Weber. If he was talking about Michel Foucault, it would have been Foucault. If he had been talking about, Lao Tzu or even Confucius, it would have been those figures that would have played a prominent role in my mind, as Marx has done. So, but I think it's really important to go back to some really fundamental texts, whether it's Plato or Tao Te Ching or, something that's just weather the storms of time, What is your, do you like the classics? I mean, a lot of the writers you mentioned are very contemporary, possibly with the exception of P.G. Wodehouse, but you're interested in reading stuff from way back when?
Part of me feels bad that I actually haven't read more of stuff like that, because I'm like, wow, I'm really living in the present. But, you know what? Part of me is also like, fuck it, I really don't care. No, actually, if it was interesting and if I could get into it, then yes. I think the thing is I found that it's not that I don't like history, it's just that it's hard for me to relate to that. And I get mad, when as much as I value other people's point of view, I get mad when there's like obvious segregation or like obvious like human incivility. It is like when people are being unnecessarily mean. I'm just like, I don't like it. I don't know. But I don't know. Do you have a suggestion? Because and I started reading Spartacus.
Howard Fast.
I like that.
Yeah.
I didn't think I would. I do.
Speaking of a struggle for freedom, you know, in the Roman times, Howard Fast was actually blacklisted, I believe. He was a communist, and he was also interested in Buddhism. He practiced meditation. A really weird guy. But that book became the basis of a movie called Spartacus. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out, because it was directed by who was the guy who did The Shining and Eyes Wide Shut? Stanley Kubrick. He did 2001, and one of his earlier masterpieces was Spartacus of Kirk Douglas. And the guy who wrote the screenplay was Dalton Trumbull, and Dalton Trumbull was also a communist, and he was blacklisted. He couldn't find a job. Speaking of, you know, a particular time in history when people are being mean, you know, to particular groups or members just because of their political beliefs. McCarthyism, right, in the 50s was something of that sort. And same thing, of course, much more severely happened in the Soviet Union against communist writers, right? People, when you know, going on trial or getting executed. So Dalton Trumbull's screenplay, I think, was the first of Spartacus, was the first to break the blacklist, you know, because Kubrick put his name. Either Spartacus or Path to Victory. I forget the title precisely, but it also stars Kirk Douglas about World War I. But you know, I think, you know, for me, I like you, when I first started to read back in high school, I only read stuff that was really viscerally interesting to me. You know, you pick it up like, oh, this is a really cool book. So, you know, Bukowski, Henry Miller, you know, these are all 20th century or post-World War II writers. But then I began to appreciate, you know, because some high school teachers, like you had a very cool high school teacher, right? So, same thing happened to me when I was taking a class in English, and we had a chance to read aloud in groups, you know, all the different parts of Midsummer's Night's Dream, right? And of course Shakespeare. When you're growing up, Romeo and Juliet, with all the different sexual innuendos, it's quite fun, you know, to really decode the language. Like, you know, I can't believe Juliet is saying, "I like to behold Romeo in death," which means I like to have an orgasm with Romeo. You know, yeah. There's all these double entendre, right?
I'm pretty oblivious to that stuff. Actually, when we read Romeo and Juliet, I remember thinking, wow, this is stupid. And and then like they made us watch the movie, and like they would fast forward through the sex scene. It was the old one with Olivia Hussey.
Oh yeah, I did see that.
Yeah, and I was like, what's this? I don't know.
Yeah, just too.
That, you know what? Yeah. Okay, so this is really a tangent, but I went to, in Virginia, they have a replica of the Globe Theater.
Oh really?
Yeah, it's called like the Black something. Bless you. And they did King Lear. And it was so awesome. So like maybe it's just reading Shakespeare that's hard or something.
I was lucky because I had a friend who was really into decoding all the body language, and we basically got the Cliff Notes, which explained everything, you know. And so we enjoy reading, and I think over the years I also like the sound of a language, you know. It's there's a poetry in Shakespeare that's often referred to, but like King Lear. What a powerful monologue that King Lear does, you know, against a storm. Yeah. That kind of a shriek of old age against the tides of fate, you know. And